Hello, my name is Samuel George London, and welcome to Comics for the Apocalypse. On today's episode, I speak to publisher of Comic Scene magazine and absolutely riveting individual, Tony Foster, about what comics he would take into the apocalypse. But before we get into it, one thing we forgot to mention on today's show is that Comic Scene also have a podcast. To have a listen, simply search for Comic Scene, the podcast, in whichever podcast service you use, and you'll find it right there. Also, this week is the last week for my latest Kickstarter, Saffron Spacetime Academy Adventures. As I speak, we've reached 75%, so still have a little way to go. But if you like the idea of a colourful, all-ages space adventure comic, then be sure to check it out by searching Saffron on Kickstarter or by following the link in the show notes. Now, without further ado, on with the show. Hello, Tony Foster. How's it going?
Very well, thanks, Sam. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. It's been a busy day and week for me, but hopefully it's going to calm down by the end of the week. But how about yourself?
Yeah, very busy day today. Been busy working on the magazine, but hopefully that's all going to calm down as well.
And you get a bit of downtime, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it must have been so busy. And kind of before we get into it, just to put it into context for anybody that doesn't know what you do, what do you do in the world of comics?
Well, I started and published and edit the magazine Comic Scene, which is a monthly magazine, which is not just out in comic shops, but also is now distributed in places like W.H. Smith and
Which
McCall.
is where I got my most recent copy. So thanks very much. I was so excited to actually buy, because I don't buy that many magazines, but I was so excited to buy a magazine from W.H. Smith. I was just over the moon. So thanks very much for that.
No problem. Which one was that? Which copy was it?
Oh, it was the Roy the Rovers one.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, the most recent one. Yeah, it was just great to kind of see that on the magazine shelves there, and kind of, you know, it just brought back so many memories. So thanks.
Fantastic. That's what it's about. So I'm glad you liked it.
Very much so. And so yeah, Comic Scene magazine. What an amazing undertaking that is.
Well, yeah, crazy undertaking, I think is the word you're looking for. Yeah, it's a bit nuts. Yeah, it was really just I started getting back into comics again, and I noticed there was a lot of things on websites and blogs and vlogs, but it seemed a bit odd that there wasn't a magazine about a print form. And I just started to play around with a few ideas, and those few ideas kind of started to rumble along, and here we are, a year later. In fact, I think we launched on May the 1st in limited places, and here we are now nationwide across the UK and an Ireland in over 1,000 stores, which is just amazing. Absolutely crazy.
Congratulations!
Thank you.
That's an incredible achievement. And as well as obviously getting it in shops, I believe you can get it online as well.
Yeah, you can. You can get a digital copy a wee bit cheaper than you can in the shops. So if you prefer to read it on your mobile phone or your tablet or your laptop, it's there for you as well. But quite a lot of people talk about the fact that people are moving to digital, but we find that in terms of percentages, more people read the magazine than on digital. But yeah, it's growing. It's growing. The people who are finding out about the magazine and wanting to read it in digital is growing too.
Amazing. And where can people get it digitally?
Well, they'll be able to go onto our website, which is going to be getmycomics.com/comic scene.
Great.
and they'll be able to order it there, and it should download for them there as well.
Fantastic. And the most recent issue that will be out in shops, I believe, was released on the 25th of April. As of today, technically, it's the 29th of April, even though we're recording this about a month before that.
Yeah,
But,
it's all started. You should try doing a magazine when you're just about to. You're releasing one magazine and then you're editing another and thinking ahead. It's all really crazy. So yeah,
that must cross so many wires in your head.
Yeah,
it must be crazy.
I feel like a bit like a time traveler. I'm not quite sure where I am. I think it's actually Christmas. Actually, now I come to think about it.
Yeah. I bet you've got the Christmas issue in your head already.
I have. It's got snow on the logo and everything.
Oh, fantastic! Looking forward to it. And I believe Comic Scene's on Twitter and Instagram and the like, aren't they?
Yeah, we've got quite a big social media presence on Twitter. I think it's Comics Flicks UK US is our handle, our Twitter handle on that, and then we're also on Facebook as well under Comics Flicks, and we've got a Comic Scene Facebook group, and we've got a Comic Scene Comic Mart where people can go on and tell people about their Kickstarters and small press comics and sell their comics as well. So yeah, there's a mix of things that people can use. Yeah.
Fantastic. Aside from all of that happy, positive news, unfortunately, I do have some bad news for you, Tony. And that's because there is an impending asteroid heading towards Earth, I'm afraid. And so my question for you is what is your action plan for survival in the interim whilst the asteroid is coming to Earth? We know that it's coming, and then what are you going to do once it hits Earth?
Well, I've been thinking about this, and I think I've got a couple of options. First, I'd like to get a team together, but I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure which team I'm likely to go with. Whether I should go for the full cast of Armageddon,
straight
or whether I or the Deep Impact team. Obviously, Armageddon had Bruce Willis, and you can never go wrong with a bit of Bruce.
Ben Affleck was in there as well.
And Ben Affleck was in, and obviously he's Batman as well. So you get double the fun there. And but on the other side, the Deep Impact team, it's Morgan Freeman as the president, and you've got Tia Leone there as well, and she'd probably make me laugh. So in terms of teams, but they're probably not going to be much use. So so I've been looking at other options as well. I thought I'd try and get hold of Jimmy Olsen's Superman watch and maybe give the Man of Steel a call, and then I realised that actually it doesn't exist, so that would be pretty much useless as well.
Oh, that's a bit of a dead end, isn't it?
Yeah. So, but fortunately, I live in a place called Kirk Newton, and Kirk Newton actually is actually the location for one of the secret bunkers from the time of the Cold War. So if there was ever going to be a nuclear strike, the cabinet, the Parliament cabinet, would be sent to one of three locations in Scotland, and Kirk Newton just happens to be one of them. And down in this bunker, it's got a number of doors in it, like Prime Minister and Home Secretary, and so I think I would try and get the keys for that, and put myself down into the bunker to protect myself from the asteroid. Take down a couple of tins of Spam with me. That should keep me going for a little while. Maybe take a few comics with me just to relieve the boredom. So yeah, I think that's how I might take on this particular asteroid. Yeah.
Fantastic. And in your preparation for going down into this this secret bunker, you're looking at your comics collection, and you want a nice array of comics. and the first comic that you want to take is the first comic you remember enjoying, and what is that comic?
That comic is Lookin', which was known as the Junior TV Times.
Yeah.
It was released in 1971, and it kept going till about 1994, I think.
Yeah, that's what I read.
Yeah. And so I would probably take Lookin' down with me. It was a sort of TV tie-in title, and I mean at the time, of course, there was only 3 channels on television, and there was no breakfast television, and there was no nighttime television. I think most of the channels probably finished at 11 o'clock with the national anthem. Right. And also at the same time, you didn't have VCRs or you won't be able to. You didn't have iPlayer or anything like that. You had to watch the program, and if you didn't watch the program, then you completely missed it. And the great thing about Lookin' was that you were able to read your favorite programs in installments over a couple of weeks. And there was some great strips in it from things like The Tomorrow People and The $6 Million Man, Bionic Woman, Charlie's Angels, Dick Turpin, Sapphire and Steel, Chips, Mork and Mindy, Buck Rogers, all that kind of stuff. And it was all done by some quite well-known artists now, like Arthur Ranson and John Burns. And it was absolutely fantastic. And it was the way that you got your TV, another fix of your TV programs. And I was quite sad about the whole thing, really. I I would get each copy, and it was the strips were on over 2 pages, and I would put them together, and the story would last for about maybe 6 weeks, 7 weeks, and I would put them all together. So it might be The Tomorrow People, and I'd put all 6 or 7 episodes together once they'd finished, and then I would read them out aloud. Amazing. Pretending it was a television program.
Yeah, totally.
And so that would be something I would probably have to take into the bunker, because not only would I be able to read it, but I'll be able to read it out aloud to myself and pretend I'm watching television programs that probably couldn't be broadcast in the bunker.
Right. I'm sure that you can find like a large cardboard box that you can cut into a mock TV as well.
Yeah,
and absolutely. Kind of put some antennas on top.
And do my own kind of karaoke as well, because Lookin' also had strips featuring some of the sort of top bands at the time, like the Beatles and ABBA and Elvis and the Bay City Rollers and Madness, and Kylie and Jason were in there, Aha. And I think Rebellion recently released the Beatles graphic novel, which originally was serialized in Lookin'. So not only would I be able to do the television programs, but I'd be able to sing all the songs as well, which would keep me occupied for many a few months while I'm trying to survive the asteroid. So yeah, Lookin' would be my first comic, I think.
Amazing. And you know what, I didn't know about this until you sent through your comic choices, and kind of looking it up and everything. What an amazing magazine to have had at the time. And as you quite rightly say, it's kind of like the iPlayer of the 70s and 80s, I guess.
Yeah,
in a way.
Yeah, there was. I mean, people talk about sort of TV tie-in comics now, but they've always been around. Even before Lookin', I think. You would have had Countdown and a TV comic, and they were absolutely brilliant. The artwork in them was fantastic, and there was a few derivatives of it. There was the Bieber magazine, which didn't last very long, but that had Grange Hill in it, which was a popular TV show at the time. And that strip was written by Pat Mills, and he talks about it briefly on our podcast, the Comic Scene podcast, I think episode 3, and there was also a magazine called Tops magazine, which was which was as close to looking as you could get, but it had a great strip with Adam the Ants. I don't know if you recall the band Adam the Ants, but it had Adam as a time traveler.
Great.
And John Freeman covered it on Down the Tubes recently, his blog, and that was a great strip as well. But Looking was the best of them all, I think, and yeah, there's some great artwork in there, and I think Rebellion have just got the rights to it within the collection that they recently acquired.
Oh, okay.
So if they can solve all the issues around it, then we might be seeing a few more strips from Looking in the future.
Wow,
which would be great. Yeah,
I'll be keen to read that.
Yeah, brilliant. Absolutely. I mean, it had stuff like Magnum PI and A-Team and stuff like that, and they've all been remade. So people do know some of the programs from the time. So yeah, it would be amazing. It would be an amazing. It was an amazing comic. It was brilliant.
Fantastic. And so you've got looking into your collection, and so you're looking around for the next category of comics, and you think to yourself, what's the funniest or the comic that made me laugh out loud the most?
The comic that made me laugh out loud. It's funny because I don't think I've laughed that much at comics, but I do recall there was about 2 or 3 titles that I can remember in my mind that made me laugh out loud.
Great.
And so it's hard to choose between the 3 of them, really. So it's probably worth me mentioning them all briefly. One was Calvin and Hobbes.
Of course.
I remember buying The Treasury of Calvin and Hobbes by, I think it's Bill Waterston, isn't it? And I remember buying it in Glasgow and getting on the bus home, which was an hour's journey. And I started reading the Calvin and Hobbes Treasury, and I just burst out laughing at every single strip in the middle of the bus journey.
Right.
And all I could think was these eyes watching me, just laughing at this book, which was just a hoot. And I hadn't had kids at the time either, and so this is what I would imagine that kids were thinking, because it wasn't that far from how I was thinking as a sort of late teenager. So I really enjoyed Calvin and Hobbes. I think it's pure genius, that particular thing. But there was a couple of other sort of American titles that made me laugh. One was called Amazing Man.
Right.
It didn't last very long. It was a DC comic, and it was about this sort of pint-sized superhero, from what I recall. But I remember, and it was written a little bit like a sitcom. So it was probably a little bit like Welcome Back Kotter meets Cheers meets Friends kind of thing. And I just remember laughing out loud at some of the scenes in it. And I think there was some sort of tender moments and some sad moments probably, but I do remember laughing at it, and that would be a great title. And the final one was Justice League, when it was drawn by Kevin Maguire.
Right.
And that was a hoot. It was, superheroes were always treated quite seriously, and then this title, Justice League, came out, and the artwork was by, I think, Kevin Maguire, and it wasn't just the story that was funny, but the way he drew it was funny as well. And interestingly enough, I would say that the movies today, particularly the Marvel movies, the humor in those lend themselves to the sort of Justice League titles humor.
Oh, great.
It's really deadpan and quite. It's not total comedy. It's kind of tongue in cheek and sarcastic at times. And I just remember reading it and laughing out loud at it. And I think it was probably quite popular at the time, or it certainly divided opinion, but I think it was still quite a popular title. But it was a great title. And I think the successful movies that are out now that are superheroes movies do lend it in terms of the script to that title. But yeah, all three of them, they all made me laugh. So
that's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
And so you start to get a little bit, I guess, reflective and thinking, right, I've got a really enjoyable comic. The first one I remember. You got loads of funny comics now, and you want something that's going to kind of stir up emotions. And so you think, what's the saddest or most upsetting comic that I've read?
Ooh. It's quite hard with comics. I've never really read a sad comic. Being sad's quite a strong emotion.
Yeah.
And I recall crying at TV programs, and I recall crying at films and crying at pieces of music. But I really don't recall ever feeling quite emotional while reading a comic. And it's been really interesting doing Comic Scene and listening to our podcast, because some people do talk about some comics that have really hit their emotions.
Yeah.
And I just haven't got round to reading them yet. So it's probably more that I'm missing out on some titles that would bring that emotion out in me than anything else. But I do recall being sad about a particular comic when it ended, which was Cheeky Weekly.
Right.
You talk about comics that make you laugh, and Cheeky Weekly made me laugh every week. It came out in 1977 and lasted till about early 1980. And Cheeky was this character who used to be in a magazine called Crazy. He was part of the Crazy Gang, and he got his own comic. And it was a brilliant comic. And I don't know if you've heard of it or seen it, but it was quite unusual comic as well, in that it gave you Cheeky's week. So it started on a Sunday, and it went through Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday.
Oh, wow.
And on each day something new happened. So he might have read a chapter of a book, and then it went into a picture strip called James Bold, and it did the sort of James, this picture strip called James Bold, and then he would then go up into his attic and find his dad's old comics, and it would then show it would then show a strip from an old comic from the sort of 1930s, 1940s, and reprint it. And then on a Saturday morning, he would go to the cinema, and it would do a sort of Warner Brothers tie-in movie with some of the cartoons that are out at that time. So it was a really fun comic to read. There's a few blogs about it, and it was quite popular. And I remember then that you saw the dreaded word "great news for all readers" inside.
Right.
And it's what's, I think, in the industry was called Hatch, Match and Dispatch, where a comic would end and they would merge it with another comic to sort of increase the readership of the other comic, and the other would then ride off into the sunset. So Cheeky was merged into Whippy at the time, and I just remember feeling completely deflated and incredibly sad. They eased you into this particular one. It was very unusual to have this, but they put sort of supplement inside Whoopi. It was 16 pages of Cheeky,
right?
Rather than just merge it and just put the best strips from one in the other, like they did with 2000 AD and Star-Lord and all this kind of stuff. And Yeah, so it was a very very sad time. However, one might say that you know, as a kid, um, having this happen to you time and time again, if you read comics, really toughened you up.
Mm.
In that you had to face this kind of grief on a regular basis every
Yeah,
sort of
just
couple of months on your favorite titles, and you had to feel sadness and bounce back. So perhaps that would be good training for being in the bunker. Perhaps it builds your resilience and makes you a
definitely
stronger person. So um, but that's the saddest I've ever felt while reading a comic.
amazing. And yeah, well, very sad. But yeah, hopefully you'll be able to reminisce
Yeah.
very,
Um,
very nicely
mhm,
with that last issue
mhm.
of Cheeky Weekly. Fantastic. And so the next category that comes to mind is scary comics, and you think, what's the scariest or most horrifying comic that I've read?
Hmm. Well, I've not read many horror comics. I'm not very attracted to them.
Right.
I tend to avoid horror movies. um, I think the most scariest movie I've ever watched was Jaws, and
Great.
and you know when that head pops out the bottom of the boat in
Yeah,
Jaws.
sure.
Yeah, I know it's coming every time, and every time it makes me jump.
It's
So
still horrific, though, isn't it?
can you imagine me watching horror movies? It would just be crazy.
Yeah, don't watch Sharknado.
Okay, I'll tell you what. I was watching Tremors the other night. Have you ever seen
Oh,
Tremors?
yeah, of course, classic.
Yeah, Tremors
Brilliant.
is one of the best movies I've ever seen in a cinema. That surprised me. It was a total random thing to go and see. I used to do sort of film promotion, and
Okay.
Tremors was one of the films that I just happened to go and see because I used to have free tickets all the time, and it's still today. And it was the first time I'd seen it in many years, and it's still a great movie. But it's probably about as much horror as I can take. Um, so I don't tend to read horror. The closest I've come to horror comics is Misty. You know,
Right.
I actually read Misty when I was a kid. I would put it in between all my comics, but I love Misty. But yeah, I think I was pretty scared of Judge Death.
Sure.
I was pretty scared of him. He was pretty
Scary.
What a character! What a brilliant character! And I think I used to have nightmares about Judge Death.
Wow.
Well, I think I read I first encountered Judge Death with the Titan reprints, and it just scared the willies out of me. It really did. But I suppose the one comic that I read recently, which really kind of scared me more than anything else because it made me think about it, was the graphic novel Sabrina, which was put forward for the Man Booker Prize. Are you aware of that?
Yeah, so I wasn't aware of it before you sent it through,
Yeah.
and kind of reading up on it, it's absolutely fascinating, and I'm really eager to get a copy of it,
Yeah.
because yeah, it sounds intense.
Well, it does, and the reason I found out about Sabrina was there was a lot of women that I knew who didn't read comics at all had started reading it,
Okay,
and that's how I found out about it. And
great.
and I don't really want to spoil the comic for people, but it really is about the sort of response of the nation and how it impacts people who are affected by an actual real tragedy. You do meet Sabrina at the beginning of the movie, but it's the comic, but in a sort of Twin Peaks style twist, she disappears, presumably murdered, or taking her own life, or whatever it is that actually happens to her. You don't really find out until you read throughout the whole comic, but it's about the reaction of people to that incident, and how they make comments about the people who are closest to them, like did this person who's her boyfriend kill her or whatever, and how they twist facts and fiction using social media, and the news and newspapers, and when you read it, that whole process is quite horrific, because as a person you can imagine yourself, God forbid, being put in that situation where people analyze you if you're around a tragedy, which could happen to anybody, and because you're aware that anybody can make comments about it, and those comments can be picked up by anybody and twisted and used, and it was quite scary to read it and to follow that narrative. So, and I'd never even thought about that before, and yeah, that really was a scary, that was quite a scary thought, and it was quite a scary book from that perspective. So yeah, Sabrina is a scary book. It's a great book.
Very much so.
It's a scary book because it's a little bit more real than Judge Death, and that in itself makes it.
It's something that can actually happen.
Yeah.
And it kind of reminded me, because the way that they kind of pitching it on I can't remember, I was looking on it on a website, is the fact that, you know, so many different people come up with conspiracy theories about the disappearance of Sabrina.
Yeah.
And it kind of reminds me of the real life situation of making a murderer. Really, and I'm not entirely sure actually, and I'd like to find out when the timeline is, because Sabrina's published in 2014, I think.
Not entirely.
And I'm trying to wonder when Making a Murderer came out.
It's probably rough. Certainly, I read Sabrina in hardback last year.
Yeah.
And I think that's when it came out. When it was started to be written, I'm not sure. It may have been about the same time. So, because certainly a lot of work's gone into it, that's for sure.
Yeah, because like reading up on it, apparently he like wasn't happy with the first draft, and he almost cancelled it.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, apparently. And so Making a Murderer is 2015. And okay, so Sabrina was put forward for the Man Booker Prize in 2018. So yeah, it would have been last year. So maybe he was slightly inspired, but I know that it was a long project by the sounds of things for him. So maybe he had the idea before that all started. Yeah. And I mean, it's just amazing, like, to think that, you know, something can happen and then so many different facts get twisted, and then, you know, somebody that's a perfectly nice person ends up as a suspect or something. You know? Yeah,
and just because of, if you read the book, you know, there's the imperfections of the people who are around Sabrina are brought to the fore, and then they're exaggerated, and the way that the narrative of the book works, the way it puts the pictures together, it's just a great book, but it is a scary book, and then, you know, it kind of just ends, and it's, you know, it's not just the life of the person who has disappeared, it's everybody around them. Their life is affected by it, even if they're not as close to her as her boyfriend was, for example. And it can be quite devastating for some people. So yeah, it's a great book, and it is a scary book when you think about it. That it could happen to us all, depending on what happens to those nearest and dearest to us, which is scary.
Very much so.
Mhm.
And so after reflecting on that, you start to think, oh, maybe I should have something a little more lighter as well.
Yeah.
And you think, what's the most meaningful comic to you?
Meaningful comic. I suppose when I was a kid, I grew up on looking, and I grew up on, reading things like Cheeky Weekly and things like that.
Mm.
But I did discover American comics in my local newsagents when I was round about 10. And American comics were still quite rare. You couldn't find them anywhere. They were in some newsagents, but not all. Um, Usually you would find them in bus stations or or railway stations, sort of in hanger racks. But there was a newsagent that was close to my grandparents, that I was able to get American comics, and I used to read Superman comics.
Great.
I thought Superman was absolutely fantastic. It was the time of Superman. The movie was out with Chris Reeve. He was celebrating 40 years. Everything was about Superman. You truly believed, a man could fly at the time. And then things were happening at the time, and Superman was due to get a revamp by a writer-artist called John Byrne, called Man of Steel, which many people may have read.
Yeah.
And but prior to that, a book came out which was called Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, and the story was written by a writer that people will know, Alan Moore.
Of course. Yeah.
And but it was drawn by probably one of the most definitive artists of Superman of my lifetime, which was Kurt Swan.
Great.
And it was penciled by George Perez, who did a sort of classic Wonder Woman comic in the Teen Titans and things like that as well. But for me, you knew that was going to be one of the last comics that Kurt Swan would actually draw Superman.
Right.
Because his artwork was probably seen as being slightly old-fashioned comparative to what they were trying to do with John Byrne, who was going to come in and kind of revitalize the character and start from scratch, and start the Superman story again from the beginning.
Yeah.
So that felt, for me, in terms of reflection, I was coming out from having been, a young teenager reading Superman comics. I was coming to the age of 18, 19 at that point, and round about that age anyway. And it just felt like you were moving from being a child to an adult.
Right.
And that comic encapsulates that period for me. And what it teaches you is that, there is people have their life stages, and comics have their life stages as well, that people can embrace and enjoy. And that was my time at that point. And now there was this new Superman coming out, and people will be living through this just now because they've done it again, with Brian Michael Bendis' new Man of Steel. And it's the same sort of, idea, in that, that whole Superman is now put on the shelf. That's what it is. And here's this new version of the character coming out. And it's also quite sad because in that you realize that, artists have their style and it's of a particular time. And then publishers want something that's new and fresh, and it doesn't matter how good you are or how well regarded you are, you're kind of sort of put on the shelf, and that's where Kurt Swan was put, and so that's kind of where why I reflect on that comic, and I think it's now seen as the sort of perfect comic where you can actually put aside all the history of a particular character and just refresh it all and start again, which has been done several times with all major characters. And it just as you get older, I think it just says, well, that was my time, that was my reflection, those were the stories that I loved. I loved the Man of Steel. I loved the John Byrne stuff, and I enjoyed everything else after that as well. And it renewed my interest in it. But when you look at it in the big picture, that's what it says to you, and that's why you reflect on it. And so that's the comic I think of to that particular question.
That's incredible. Yeah, and so the next category that kind of comes to mind, because you've got all of these great comics lined up, you start to think, what's the most underrated comic that I've read?
Yeah, there was a couple of sort of great comics that I really enjoyed reading around about the time of the start of the Vertigo titles by DC Comics. Some of them were Vertigo, some of them weren't, but they kind of fall within that parameters. One would have been Sandman Mystery Theater,
right?
Which I really enjoyed. One would have been the Question by Dennis O'Neil and Dennis Cowan. It was a relaunch of the Steve Ditko character. And I also really liked The Shadow by Andy Helfer and Bill Sienkiewicz.
Great.
And so all three of them are kind of not superheroes, they're more pulp heroes.
Yeah.
Kind of probably around the time that Warren Beatty did Dick Tracy. And I just love those characters. I just love that. I love seeing that in comics, that kind of pulpy detective mystery, kind of 1930s, 1940s style comics.
Yeah.
And
everybody's got a trilby.
Yeah, everyone's got a trilby. You can't beat a trilby. I mean, it's up there with a fez. Do you know what I mean? And a bow tie. Definitely. It's like you've got to wear a trilby. And I love seeing that in comics. I just even now, even today, I'm attracted to a comic that has a trilby and that kind of pulpy feel to it. And yeah,
just out of interest, Gateway City.
Yeah, I saw that, yeah. I'm attracted to that particular comic. I haven't read it yet, but no. If I'm at a convention and I see it, I know I'll pick it up because it just screams at me, buy me,
Oh yeah, definitely. It'd be right up the street.
And you can't. And what's interesting is I think these kind of comics are slightly underrated.
Yeah.
But they are really, great comics. In comics, I think were really made for those kind of stories, more so than probably superheroes. It really lends itself to that genre, and they're as good as the movies. They're absolutely fantastic stories, and not many people go wrong with a trilby. So
no.
Yeah, I really do like those particular titles. They really stand out, and I loved waiting to get them and read them when they came out. Absolutely brilliant.
Fantastic. And of course they inspired quite a few iconic things today, particularly The Question and The Shadow.
Yeah, I think that The Question probably inspired I think it definitely inspired some of the characters in Watchmen, because I think Watchmen was based on some of the characters from the stable of comics that The Question was from. And of course, The Shadow is known for influencing Batman, I think. And is quite a strong character in himself, and it's always great to see a new Shadow comic coming out. And I think there's been a number of Dynamite ones recently, and crossovers with Batman as well, which is fantastic. And yeah, it was a great. He's a great character. Great character.
Brilliant. And so we come on to the most difficult question for your collection, and that is for you. What's the best comic of all time?
Ooh, best comic. I was really lucky to sort of, I feel really lucky to have been brought up with sort of early 2000 AD, and then see UK creators be discovered, I suppose, by America, to go over there and do comics for the American market. And one of the first people to be able to do that was Alan Moore. And he went over and he did the series Swamp Thing.
Yeah.
And you don't really hear much about Alan Moore's Swamp Thing compared to things like Watchmen, etc. But I think it was his best work. I think it was absolutely fantastic. Not only because he took this kind of pulpy, silly, green monster type thing and completely flipped it on his head and made the readers rethink what it actually was. But the stories themselves were quite stunning, and the artwork as well, with John Tottleben and Steve Bissett. It just was a fusion of creative genius at the time. And the reason it's quite an important comic as well is because it was the first time that people had a chance to see what UK creators could do and their imagination could achieve. It kind of ride on the tails of this, comics are for grown-ups. I'm not necessarily convinced about that. I think, kids could enjoy them too. I think we underestimate, the sort of 11, 12, 13-year-olds and what things they're really interested in. And they're not quite adults, but they really do like this kind of stuff. I suppose, earlier on, I said that I did read horror comics, but I never thought of Swamp Thing as a horror comic.
Right.
It didn't even occur to me that it was. It had quite horrific things in it now looking back, but it was better than that. It was bigger than that as a title. And of course it was the first comic that at the time didn't. There was the Comics Code Authority stamp that was on comics and American comics, and it was the first comic to drop that, and it kind of inspired the Vertigo line for DC Comics, and I think Swamp Thing eventually went into the sort of Vertigo line, and I think without the work that Alan Moore, I'm not sure whether Vertigo would have happened. And I'm not sure there's all these different new comics, both. It's quite crazy when you think about it, that the British comics, they wanted British creators to go over to the States, and then the work that the British creators did in the States also would then influence what was happening in British comics at the time. So it was really quite an exciting and eclectic time. And but it brought these Vertigo titles out, and if it hadn't been for Vertigo, you wouldn't have had Sandman Mystery Theater, you wouldn't have had Sandman by Neil Gaiman, you wouldn't have seen these kind of titles come out, and you might not have seen the same sort of comics that are coming out now from small press and indie creators if it hadn't been for that title of Swamp Thing and what Alan Moore achieved in that short run that he did from issue 20. And it was absolutely stunning stuff, what he did, and it showed what British creators could do for American comics and comics in general, and it was quite an exciting time, and it's quite an exciting title, and people should go out and buy it right now.
Oh, too right. It's an absolute classic, and kind of reading up on it. I mean, Swamp Thing was going to be cancelled, wasn't it? And then they just took a punt on Alan Moore, basically. And he brought it back from the brink, which is amazing. And then, as you say, kind of started this whole surge of British comic creators, and everything that came with it, like with the likes of Neil Gaiman and later on Grant Morrison and everybody, Mark Miller and all that jazz. What an incredible kind of legacy that has, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think when Alan Moore left the title, I think Rick Veitch took it on, but after him, I think Grant Morrison wrote it, and Mark Miller wrote it as well, I think. So yeah, it was a great character, a great set of stories from Alan Moore, and certainly probably one of the best comics I think I've ever read.
Fantastic. And so what happens is that you have all of these in your collection and you're on your way to the bunker, but unfortunately you don't get there by the time that it's nightfall, and it's a freezing night up in Scotland, I'm afraid. And so you have to use the comics as for firewood, because there's no firewood around, but you're able to keep one for the bunker. So which one do you keep?
Goodness, I think the book I would keep would be Calvin and Hobbes.
Great,
because it's a really thick book, The Treasury.
It's got a lot of volumes.
It's got a lot of volumes. And I think it would make me laugh when I needed it. It's got some stories of hope in it, I think, through the eyes of a child. And I think it also shows that it's okay to have an imaginary friend. And if I'm stuck in this bunker on my own, then, I can always pretend I've got a stuffed tiger talking to me, and that'll be fine. So I think I'd probably go with the Calvin and Hobbes choice.
Great. And along with your copy of Calvin and Hobbes, you're allowed a weapon, tool, or useful item to take in with you. What is it?
I think. There's a definite. Have you ever seen Batman?
Yeah.
With Michael Keaton.
Of course.
Yeah, when Michael Keaton is faced as Bruce Wayne against the Joker, I think he pulls out a fire poker.
Yes.
And he goes, "You want to get nuts? Let's get nuts." And,
that classic, yeah.
And I think if a fire poker is good enough for Michael Keaton, Bruce Wayne, and Batman against the Joker, then I think during an apocalyptic event like an asteroid hitting me, then I think a metal fire poker is the way I want to go. So yeah, I think I'll go for that if I can find one.
Oh yeah, I'm sure we can get you one of those for sure. Thank you so much for sharing your comics for the Apocalypse, Tony Foster. It's been a real pleasure. And for one more time for the listeners, where can they find you on the internet?
Yeah, well, you can see us on comicsflix.org. That's our news site in between copies of Comic Scene. You can also read more about Comic Scene at comicscene.org if you wish. You can buy Comic Scene on our shop website, getmycomics.com, Comic Scene. And of course, you can see us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, sharing our love of comics. And of course, you can also get the magazine itself monthly, usually towards the end of the month, in WH Smith, McCall's, Eason's in Ireland, and Sainsbury's, all good comic shops, and the website as well.
Fantastic. And then do you have any events coming up this year at all?
I'm afraid I don't. We're really busy with the magazine and have been for the last sort of 12 months. We're hoping that if all goes well, and it seems to be going well at the moment, more and more people are hearing about the magazine, more people are picking it up. More people are hopefully seeing it as one of the definitive magazines about comics in the UK and Ireland, that it will allow us to maybe visit some comic conventions next year.
Great.
And meet people directly and chat to people directly and share the magazine with them directly. So we would hope to do that. We're playing around with a few different things in the magazine now, including sharing some comic strips that perhaps had limited distribution in sort of small press and indie that are deserve a bigger audience. So hopefully more people will get a chance to see them. But we're at comic conventions. We do have a team of people who go out and share the magazine. But in terms of in person, that's probably going to be hopefully in 2020.
Amazing. I mean, it just sounds like the future, doesn't it? 2020.
Yeah, it does, and then I'll stop behaving like the Scarlet Pimpernel and actually meet some people, which would be great.
Brilliant, Tony. Well, thanks again for your time today, and I hope to see you at one of those events next year.
Fantastic. No, thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks again to Tony for being on Comics for the Apocalypse. It was an absolute pleasure. If you enjoyed the show today, please leave a review for us on iTunes or whichever podcast service you use, as not only will it let me know that you liked it, but I believe that it helps make other people aware of the show as well. If you'd like to check out Tony's work or follow him on social media, those links are in the show notes, along with all of our own links to the various areas of the internet. And finally, as long as the apocalypse doesn't come to pass in the next week, I'll see you next Monday. Bye for now.